all around you. Wake up, the shock is what will grow you. So wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. This is the place where we start again. Oh, this is the time when we make amends. Oh, this is how we learn at the point of no return. So don't go backwards, my friend. Yeah, I have been praying for intervention. The world is changing, changing. Nature abused, harmony forgotten. And I was suffering, no, no. Looking.
You are listening to Christian Guidance Counseling Online. I am your host, Shannon Lynn. Today in this podcast, I want to take you on a journey that leads you to the answers you have always been looking for. This is the spot, as this podcast is your online portal to finding help, hope, and restoration for your soul. No matter what you are facing, you and I will face those challenges together in this hour of power. Here we will embrace knowledge, stand in courage together to help you embark safely and confidently on your self-awareness journey in love and forgiveness. Become empowered, energized, and revived as you become awakened to your spiritual awareness. Power through life's challenges. Endeavor to trust God with your heart as you become awakened to self, as you learn to love your soul. Christian Guidance Counseling Online shares with you the love of our Father's heart through thought-provoking insight and guidance, as these messages are from God's heart to yours, as they are also from your guidance counselor, me, Shannon Lynn.
I am here beside you. Wake up, light is all around you. Wake up, this shock is meant to grow you. So wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. This is the place where we start again. Oh, this is the time when we make amends. Oh, this is how we learn at the point of no return. It's a beginning, this is not the end. Oh, this is the place where we start again. Oh, this is the time when we make amends. Oh, this is how we learn to love, we return. So don't go backwards, my friend. Transcend this, transform and transcend this. Though it hurts and feels strange, we can transcend this in the end. Don't you know we have to change, my friend?
There's an oddity when it comes to trauma, and that is that not everyone responds to trauma in the same way. There are people who rise above trauma and are not affected or impacted negatively to the negative situations that they face. And then there are those who are traumatized in such a way that trauma follows them through emotional pain for a very long time. And sometimes this emotional upheaval lasts throughout their lifetimes. Individuals who have been traumatized by people and events carry around with them a very low sense of self-worth. And for this reason, it makes it extremely difficult to maneuver around life's natural ups and downs, because their low self-esteem was also formed out of traumatic events, either remembered or forgotten. The individuals who are able to rise above trauma and not allow it to negatively impact them, they have a really good grasp on knowing who they really are, as they are self-aware and have a really, really good feeling about themselves. They know that when bad things happen, this doesn't diminish their self-worth. They are emotionally strong as they are propped up in love, as they truly do love themselves and they are confident in knowing who they are and what they're capable of achieving. Now, those who feel the emotional impact of trauma most likely were not given the chance to fully and completely love themselves. Many people who have a low self-worth do not carry around the confidence that allows one to appreciate themselves for who they truly are. Instead of looking always to the good in one's soul, this person who suffers from trauma looks to the bad things about their character. When you stub your toe, oh gosh, that really hurts. And I know this is a very poor example, but I'm going somewhere with this. When you stub your toe, the pain is so severe initially that you wonder if you actually broke your toe. The pain is so intense, and you hold your toe and wiggle it to make sure it still moves, and then you tell yourself, I'll be okay, and you move on even though there's still pain there. But you feel that hurt just a little less. The trauma of stubbing your toe doesn't ruin your day. It's an event that happened and you move on from it with the security of knowing that, okay, you're going to be fine. Maybe bruised, but you're not injured. The pain from your stubbed toe is only temporary. This analogy can be used to help explain what it is like with someone who can rise above traumatic events. They know how to self-nurture and tap into that innate security that tells them they will be okay. Life is not over just because one stubbed their toe. That's kind of irrational, isn't it, to assume this? It's just a mere inconvenience. However, when someone is traumatized, they do turn to irrational thoughts and irrational feelings. The kind of confidence and self-nurturing quality that a person has who is self-assured, well, this isn't in the mindset of someone who suffers trauma. They look at the trauma with dissatisfaction that creates a dis-ease as the emotional pain becomes long-lived. Like physical disease negatively impacts the body, trauma creates a disease of the spirit. The longer one lives in this emotional dysfunction, the greater the negative impact in one's life, and eventually it will affect one's body also. Trauma causes grief, and grief is defined as being a strong and overwhelming emotion. However, I'd like to define grief as being a state of shock. Now, the body, when it endures shock, when it's highly stressed, the body can become diseased, and the soul can become emotionally diseased with negativity. It isn't such a stretch of the imagination to conclude that the spirit can undergo shock, as this is my belief that it does. And I have come to this conclusion in dealing with my own childhood trauma. Just as much as the body endures stress and can endure a physical shock, well, our souls can get that way too and suffer from spiritual shock. When the body goes through shock, the blood flows slowly, and this creates a negative environment as the organs signal the brain that they're not getting enough oxygen. This is kind of a slow death, and sometimes people do not recover from shock to the body. The trauma is just too great. Shock, in my opinion, is a symptom that shows us something is desperately wrong. And grief is the shock to the spirit that tells us that something is deeply, deeply wrong inside. We need help. And many of us, because when we are so young, when the emotional trauma happened, we could not work out that shock. We couldn't look at the symptoms of the shock because we didn't know how. And so as we matured, we learned to just survive and to live to reach another day through the lens of shock, not realizing that as each day passes, we are still grieving as we are living in shock, not realizing that this is damaging. to our soul. For those of you who are living with the shock of trauma that happened to you, this podcast is for you. It's time to stop owning the trauma that happened by calling it your trauma. It's time to acknowledge that, okay, trauma happened to you, but you do not own it. And your spirit reacted in shock. And you didn't have the emotional tools back then to help you overcome the shock to heal. Now you do, because in this podcast, I am going to share with you something so amazing that will take you out of the shock of trauma and deliver you from the disease of the spirit so that you can live in confidence and self-assurance. Trauma happens. We face traumatic situations regularly. For those of us who are or have faced our childhood trauma, we know that trauma is a way of life. Bad things happen, and we can't get around that fact. However, trauma from a spiritual perspective is a way to reveal to us who we think we are. Trauma exposes our weaknesses through revealing the outlook we have about ourselves. For some of us, we have never had the chance to experience what it was like to be ourselves in childhood, as we were robbed of it, as we were forced into adult situations, as we were led by adults who didn't understand how to care for us in a way that would develop our inner character to be self-confident and tenacious with creativity and self-assurance. Instead, our characters never had a chance to develop that kind of strength. And so when trauma came along, we were at the mercy of shock. Some of us did not know how to deal with that. We didn't know how to grieve, as we were too young to figure that out. And so we sat with the silence of shock, and that became our homing beacon. That shock became that familiar place as we allowed this to guide us in life. Our reactions, our thought patterns, our self-esteem has become rooted in the emotional disease of shock. This is the equivalent to the valley of shadows of death the Bible talks about. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Psalms chapter 23, verse 4. We have had no idea that Jesus was with us, because in those dark days we felt so alone. And for those of us who haven't been raised on Scripture, understanding that Jesus was with us the whole time to comfort us is kind of a moot point. You can't see what you can't see, and you can't know what you don't know. Even though Jesus was and is always with us, the shock covers his presence up like an invisible cloak. We literally feel like we are alone and life is as good as it will ever get. When people say, oh, just give it to Jesus, or Jesus loves you, I would just like to say this as a sideline note. Please don't say this to somebody who has been traumatized. We have to believe it to feel it, and our belief is rooted in shock as it becomes our safety net. It isn't something we want, but it is the only thing we know. We know pain from our parents, and we know pain from our loved ones, and when they hurt us and turned around to say that they love us, hearing from someone else that Jesus loves us, these words don't carry much weight because we've learned to not rely on the words of other people. When someone who is living in their trauma hears that they are valuable and that you are the apple of God's eye, you can hear this from thousands of people and it is still hard to believe. Why? You take you wherever you go. So you know yourself best. You are as close to a best friend, a parent, a lover to yourself as you get, and you are unable to explore the love within these roles because shock has you married to it. Shock is kind of like your spiritual husband, as shock rules you to tell you what to say. It dictates to you what you will do, and it also dictates how you will think. Shock has you say to yourself, as you are convinced you are not worthy, You believe this as your life reflects this. And so you end up serving the spiritual disease, thinking, well, at least you're alive and you have some good things around you, so that's good enough, right? Do you know the shock you carry around you has a name? You two haven't been formally introduced. Shock has deliberately hidden itself from you so that you do not see you for who you truly are, and so you don't see shock for what it truly is. Shock is also called ego, and the ego is rooted in fear. This is the reason why your life is as it is. Your ego is in the way of your happiness, as it is your ego that keeps you trauma-bound to your grief, as you live in shock, not in love. Your ego has attached itself to you because it needs a weakened spirit to survive. Shock does not thrive in a confident host. Because we are in shock and have yet to go through the grieving process of our pain, we normalize our hurt and assume that the way to fix our situation is with the things gained of this world. We think that life will bring to us our happy, when it is the lies of the ego that tell us this is the way to go. Because if we ever looked inwardly, we would have to chase down the ego to subdue it. The ego wants to remain in control and needs you to fear yourself. So you embrace life while ignoring yourself because that is the only way fear or shock can continue to live. Have you noticed about the things of this world? That you can accumulate all the wealth, the fame, the fortune, and still it isn't enough to fulfill you emotionally? You can't get enough pats on the back from a job well done, and you can't get enough likes on social media, and you can't buy enough cars to find a satisfaction that alleviates the emptiness and pain you feel inside. Why? Physical things cannot heal the wounds of the spirit. Superficial things can never satisfy something so meticulous as the human heart. We give life our external focus, hoping that these things we gain will help us feel better about ourselves. When no, they don't. Why? At the end of the day, we still feel terrible as these things we accumulate on the outside of ourselves just act as a band-aid. We feel good in the moment. Sure, that's awesome. But what about when that band-aid comes off? Ouch! Those inner wounds are still there. So what do? We fill the void with more things. We replace what we lost thinking that is the only way to regaining our happiness and joy. But the cycle repeats. Loss and gain, loss and gain. With each loss, we feel hopeless, and with each gain, we feel somewhat elated and joyful. And that joy is strong at first, yes, and oh, it feels good. And then the joy slowly dissipates. What kind of harmony in life is that? So to keep the harmony and keep the continuity flowing, we seek out more money, more friends, more travel, and post our pictures on the social media pages, just to retain that initial feeling of joy and harmony. And at the end of the day or at the end of the week, when the thrill is over, we don't feel quite right. Something's off. Why? You may have said to yourself, things will get better when money comes in, or things will settle down when the job opportunity happens. When these things happen, are you ever satisfied? Okay, maybe for a time, sure. But satisfaction is always fleeting. Why? Well, your anchor is not found in money or social groups or vacations. The people who are not challenged emotionally by trauma, they bounce back fairly quickly. And they have something that you don't have. It's not your fault, but it's helpful to know this because you can have what they have. You can rise above the trauma, and how you do this is to know one thing. Your anchor in life is you. You are it, kiddo. And that is something that these self-confident people have, is that they bounce back so quickly from trauma is because they rely on themselves, their self-confidence, their self-awareness, their self-assuredness, because they already have something in them that they know they have. And you have this thing too. You just don't know you have it. And what is that? It's love. If you have listened to my YouTube videos, then you know that I turn to God for help and counsel all the time. And you will also know I love going deep. I love that deep dive to search out meaning because I want my why answered. For me, it's been a wonderful spiritual journey of healing for the past 10 years or so, and I personally have been on a vision quest that took me on a dark night of the soul, and I bounced around through various types of meditation, and oh, let me tell you, these did work, but their effectiveness wasn't lasting. And so I would reach down deeper into the heart of me to figure out why. What was I missing? Well, having a spiritual awakening is absolutely amazing. And I encourage everyone to make that journey. However, I have to say this, as this is just a little bit of unsolicited advice. Don't get too far ahead of yourself where you forget yourself. You take you wherever you go in life. You cannot ignore you. Shock causes you to look at the pain, but not look at yourself. Shock causes us to isolate ourselves. And in that isolation, we end up ignoring ourselves and giving all the attention to the pain. We look at the pain, we feel it, and this makes us aware of it, but we don't know how to heal or transcend it. And so we look at it some more and we feel it some more. And this makes us aware of it some more. But how do we kick that gosh awful feeling in the assets so that we can finally be free and feel whole again? Well, we have to simply stop giving shock so much attention and give that attention to ourselves. Well, this is easier said than done, my friends. In searching for myself, I admit I neglected myself. I gave so much attention to the fact that I had mommy and daddy issues. Notice I said had. I was so confounded by the lack of attention that I had as a child that I couldn't figure out that I could give myself attention now. Instead, I gave all my efforts towards fueling the ego, the shock receptors that created fear in me. I had no time to concentrate on me, let alone develop a me that I could be happy with. And I found myself back at ground zero. I did a full circle around spiritual enlightenment. I was thriving in the hard work, but I was still seeking out a way to survive. And with each new hurdle I overcame, I went searching for more hard work, convinced there was still more work in me to be done. Why? Because I quantified my unworthiness. This limiting feeling of unworthiness was unlimited in me, and I realized that no matter how much work I did on myself, all this efforting would never be enough. The path to enlightenment isn't so enlightening if you transcend the experience of what it is like to be you. You cannot find fulfillment without self-discovery, and self-discovery only comes to you through self-mastery. But how? Through honesty. The shock of your trauma doesn't want you to ever discover yourself through honesty because shock hides you behind lies, as shock is rooted in fear. So may I ask you a question? What's it like to be you? Only you can experience you to the full and complete measure that is you. What things do you think about? What is your self-dialogue like? What are your weaknesses and your strengths? When you can answer these and sit with the answers and accept them through the veil of honesty, then you, my friend, are meeting yourself where you are at. And that's a good place to start from. Many of us ignore ourselves as shock helps us to play pretend. We pretend that the outside world is exactly what our inside world needs. A little bit of this and more of that, as the outer world holds luxuries and necessities, but these are things our inner beings don't even recognize. Why? because we need something that will help heal our emotional pain. The shock of enduring and witnessing trauma needs to be cured. We can't find a cure-all with food and clothes and cars, social status, money, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The feelings that we feel about ourselves directly affect our external world, as our external world mirrors our internal world. There is scientific evidence to support this, that what we think about on a subconscious level is brought back to us on a physical level. The subconscious is the tricky dicky of our human experiences. It is a dominating force but hides behind a veil of our unawareness. Instead of trying to satisfy your inner world by turning to the outside world, how about just letting your inner world affect and influence your outer world? This is exactly how people who are least affected by trauma live. They let who they know they are control their environment. Their self-confidence within controls their environment on the outside of themselves. Just think about that for a minute. Wouldn't that be nice for you? But what does that look like? Have you ever heard the saying, as so within, so without? What this means is instead of allowing life to spiral out of control by having life control you from what you see and from what you experience on the outside of you, sit with your feelings, those inner feelings, and shift your inner world from negative thinking to positive thinking. For example, when something happens, it is a natural response for us to turn to panic. This is a natural response within the environment of shock. But what if instead of turning to that natural shock absorber, which are negative feelings you learned, to instead transcend that shock by turning to thoughts and feelings that added positive value to your inner world? What if instead of thinking of a negative outcome, you sat with those feelings to think about positive solutions that had the outcome go in your favor? It is common for us to turn to the things of our outer world in attempts to problem solve what we are feeling inside, instead of turning to the luxuries of this world to navigate your way through storms by convincing yourself more money is all you need, or a new job, or a better home. I invite you to look at your fear. Look at the panic. Look at the doubt. Look at those feelings that say you are unworthy and not good enough. Sit with them and just look. Those feelings are the monsters hiding in your closet. They are those shadows that go bump in the night. You know, as a kid, you had your parents, or maybe you even had yourself go on a nightly routine of checking for monsters in the closet and under the bed. That routine now is entirely up to you spiritually. You have to sit with those feelings so you can see them, and you look at them so you can figure out a way to chase them out of your life. This podcast will give you what you need to do just that. Life. It only appears to happen on the outside of you. Where the magic really happens is all in here, inside of you. That's the place where many of us like to avoid, because in here is where the void is. In here is where realness rests. And sometimes looking at that realness isn't so comforting, because those monsters are keeping you from keeping it real. They are keeping you from yourself. When people begin to look at themselves, an inner change happens that affects your outer world. It's small at first, and when you keep at it, when you sit with this long enough, you'll find a solution to your inner questions, and those answered questions will eventually begin to shape your outer world in a new way that is fan-frickin-tastic. I'm here to tell you, if you want to heal of your trauma, you can. However, you have to get honest with yourself, and honesty sometimes gets a little ugly. The struggle is real. The trauma is painful, and there is nothing like the honest truth to set you free. And it does take a lot of effort. Sometimes efforting can get in your own way. So to get out of your own way, we need to sit with those uncomfortable feelings and find a way to positively unstuck ourselves. Most of the reasons why we panic and turn to fear is because we don't have a solution to the problem. Yes, you do. Shock tries to tell us that we are not smart enough or worthy enough to figure it all out. The trick to usurping shock is to figure out who you were before shock arrived. So tune in and listen up, because you're going to learn a wonderful takeaway as your freedom within this podcast is just around the corner. May I ask you another question? What does your inner dialogue with yourself sound like? Oh, I can't do this. I was so stupid to even try. I'm never going to be able to overcome this. Oh, I hate myself. Oh, I'm so dumb. I'm such an idiot. I wish I wasn't even me. I wish I were dead. I know. We've all said these things from time to time. We're pretty harsh on ourselves. But it's okay. You're in good company, because Job actually cursed the day he was born, and King David, well, have you read the book of Psalms lately? Sometimes that man was downright lowly and full of self-pity. Even as a king in all his wealth and fame, David lost his self-confidence. Negative self-chatter is normal as this happens, but we need to keep it in check. When we feel hopeless, this is when chatter erupts. We cover up that hopelessness with things that make life seem hopeful, and these things are from our outer world. Ever wonder why the wealthy man Jesus talked to walked away in tears? Because the man invested himself in his wealth. He had nothing, as he believed he was nothing without his money. This man was empty inside. He had nothing in the way of self-worth, as he relied on his riches. The story isn't to teach us that we should be poor. We are allowed to be wealthy, but nowhere does the Bible say that we should live a meager existence. It's quite the contrary. The moral of the story of the wealthy man is to show us that money accumulated without first finding abundance within will always keep us living in a state of lack from within. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. Negative talk comes from a feeling of believing we are inadequate. It's a method of self-sabotage, as it's also a method of self-defeat, as these are the connective branches that are born from living in shock. Every negative thought and feeling comes from somewhere, and it isn't God. It comes from a source that is rooted in decay. Shock. Remember earlier, we learned that shock is how the body tries to survive a physical trauma. As the body's blood pressure decreases and tissues and organs become oxygen deprived, shock can also make itself known spiritually. And the spiritual deprivation that emotional shock creates is a lack of love. Love is likened to our spiritual oxygen. And where there is a lack of love, there is only depreciation, a form of spiritual decay. So getting honest with yourself means to admit to yourself that maybe you don't like yourself so much. Okay, that's okay. You might even go so far as to say you hate yourself. And this may even cause self-loathing. But what if we just faced that for a moment? What if we just looked at ourselves in the mirror and asked ourselves, why do we hate ourselves so much? Let me ask you. What is so bad about you? Self-depreciation is hate-mongering, as the words we tell ourselves sink down deep into the nether regions of our beings. The words we say rest within our subconscious, and these words add fuel for the shock that needs our fear to thrive. Contrary to popular belief, hating yourself is not having anger towards you. In the Bible, hate simply means to ignore or to turn away from because of a strong dislike. An example of this biblically would be to turn away from our sin. So to hate something means you turn your back on it, you walk away from it and ignore it, and this is what shock causes us to do. Shock causes us to ignore ourselves, which is the equivalent of hating ourselves. When we do our best to fill our inner world with outer world things, we actually ignore ourselves as we ignore our inner problem. We think that the problem will go away when we accumulate money, fame, and things. And the reality is, you take you wherever you go, as you are your best friend or worst enemy. You are your weakest link, and you are your strongest ally. It's your choice who you want to be for yourself. Avoiding yourself is no longer working. And we ignore ourselves because we assume there is a problem. Well, there is, but the trauma is only part of the problem. We ourselves are the problem as we complicate the issue by making ourselves the focal point of the problem as we become the problem. Since we don't know how to fix the inner problem that trauma caused, we can't identify it. We assume then we must be flawed in some way. We self-diminish ourselves and compare ourselves to others. Instead of sitting with these negative thoughts and feelings, we cover it up with things of this world, hoping that these things of this world will be our problem solver. So let's just backtrack for a bit, because I do have another question for you. In what ways do you ignore yourself? Ignoring yourself only confirms your trauma. It's a way to avoid looking at the strong emotions that were formed from your trauma. Ignoring yourself is what keeps you stuck. You gotta be the one to unstuck yourself if you're going to get better. You take you wherever you go. I have a life hack to share with you. Did you know that it doesn't matter who likes you in this world and who doesn't? It doesn't matter if your parents disowned you or your friends hate you or your coworkers are jealous of you. Their behavior is on them. What only matters in life is that you like you. You are your own best friend or your worst enemy. You are your own lover or fighter. It's time to make peace with yourself and end this inner war. Self-denial is one of the other branches that come from shock. Self-denial is lying. As you lie to yourself and hide yourself away from you, from showing up for yourself in life and showing up for others in your true, authentic self. I got another life hack here for you that may help you. Your presence in life is not to impress others. How has impressing others actually served you? It hasn't. It only hinders your growth. Because in pleasing others, you actually are denying yourself. How many of you have betrayed yourself by saying yes to something you wanted to say no to? It happens. We were not born people pleasers, but shock creates people pleasing in us. Your presence in life is to show you who and what you are made out of. You are meant to impress yourself and be impressionable to others to help them say those brave things and be courageous in their authenticity too. Your life is a gift because you are that gift to the world. And now it's time to see you shine. We all are gathered here together today, listening to this podcast because we have a desire to feel just a little bit better about ourselves. What would happen if we just accepted that and appreciated that for what it is? Have you ever asked yourself what it would look like to live your life free from those negative thoughts? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to actually just be okay with who you are? Those bad feelings that you carry around act as extra baggage, and that's not your fault. Those feelings that you accumulated through trauma, they didn't begin with you. They came from somewhere, and we will discover that together today in this podcast. It's kind of time we looked at those feelings, as you can give yourself permission to really, really, really like yourself, because liking yourself is an amazing place to be. What can you do to like yourself? If you have this belief of yourself that your life sucks and your life is bad and that you are the worst person ever to live, how do you suppose you could ever change that? Now, self-help methods do work, but at the end of the day, you may end up just spinning yourself into a rut as you try to do more, thinking that you have to do more, as doing more never seems to be enough, but it's all you know how to do. And I'm speaking from experience, so please be careful. Because the more I was convinced in my unworthiness, the more information I found that led me on a path to worthiness. And when I surpassed that understanding, I found myself searching for more and more. And I didn't realize that this searching was my excuse that I was hiding behind so that I would not have to accept the inevitable. What is the inevitable? Well, I'm going to get to that later on. But right now, I would like you to write on a piece of paper so we don't forget what is the inevitable, because the answer will be coming shortly. But for now, I'll give you a hint. As the ego is a tricky trickster leading us to believe we have found the truth when really we are believing in a lie as truth. When I realized this, I actually felt like Morpheus in the Matrix movie, not realizing that his promised land wasn't the path to freedom as he led himself to believe. Self-help methods lead us to freedom, but they are not the promised land. You take you wherever you go, so keep this in mind. I realized that if I personally accepted the inevitable, that would mean all this pain and heartache I've been carrying around since day one was all in vain. It was meaningless. It would be invalid. All that inner work, all that strength gained and knowledge learned, all that hard work to achieve greatness in my personal confidence would be gone. Oh no, this was a personal achievement that no one could take away. And the people that traumatized me already took away so much of me that I have actually had to fight tooth and nail, so to speak, to gain it back. So no, accepting the inevitable was not acceptable. However, in understanding the inevitable, I have learned that my achievements only add to what is already inside of me. I don't have to invalidate anything that I've done. I came to realize that my ego was talking to me and lying to me, trying to convince me of a lie as a truth, that I would have to give up something of myself in order to release the burden of the pain. And the ego is tricky like that because fear needs us as its host to stay alive. Shock is devious like that. Accepting the inevitable means to allow your inner you to grow up, as it's important to silence the temper and quiet the fears. It's a really strange feeling to let go of everything you've ever known, even if what you have known has been working against you. What I mean is that when you realize that you've got to let go of the shock and awe and the trauma, and you have to face all this fear and face the things that caused you the most anxiety, you've got to face that and challenge yourself to just look at it and see it for what it is. That's when the shock creeps in and starts lying to you and tells you that you're going into uncomfortable territory, and that's where fear is really residing. So you don't want to go into that uncomfortable area because you're going to meet monsters there that you've never faced before, and you're not strong enough to face them. So you might as well just stay where you're at. And all of this comes from a place that tells you that you are unworthy. Self-improvement, my friends, is never a bad thing, provided that the motives come from a place of learning, not fixing. The more I told myself I am not good enough, I found self-help methods to utilize that would validate that strong belief, that I needed to be fixed. And the truth is far different than what shock leads us to believe, because there's nothing wrong with us. We don't need to be fixed. We need to be nurtured. There's a difference. And the lie is this, That shock convinces you that you are unworthy. And you allow yourself to be convinced because you assume that you are unworthy and unlikable based on other people's reactions of you that had nothing to do with you. That's an epiphany right there. The trauma you endured as a child that had one or both parents hurt you physically or emotionally, the trauma that you endured as a child that had your sibling harm you, the trauma that you endured in your teens of a deep betrayal of someone you thought was a friend, the trauma you endured when your parents divorced, the trauma you endured at the death of your friend or a loved one, the trauma you endured from moving from one school to another, these things that happened, even you being bullied on the school playground, these things that happened to you, they happened to you, yes, but they didn't happen to you because of you. There's a difference. You are not the reason why these bad things happened to you. The lie that you are unworthy was formed around these bad things. It was easier to blame yourself because you could not understand these situations any other way because you were not mentally mature enough to understand that parents fight and don't always get along, and sometimes they do need to live apart. You could not understand that the bully was picking on you because they were probably picked on in their family home. You couldn't formulate and understand this on your own because you didn't have the capacity to understand the motives of other people. People's motives are something that remain secret and hidden and only knowledgeable to them. And then even sometimes people's motives are hidden from themselves. So you turned around and gave these situations meaning that were important to you by shifting the blame on you because you couldn't make sense any other way. This was the only way you knew how to survive. Does this make sense to you? You hoodwinked yourself in attempts to survive the toxic environment that you couldn't understand on your own. Instead of asking your parents why they were getting a divorce, you shouldered that pain that you might be the reason, that you were perhaps a burden, when that was never the case at all. Did you ever ask a bully why they were picking on you? I don't think anyone ever does. I know I never did. And it's because we're too young to understand. We don't know the motives behind the reasons why people do what they do. So now you see the lie that we are unworthy. You see that now, right? You see it for what it is. It's an assumption. It's a lie built on an assumption. And that assumption you will never win. So now that this major lie has been exposed, what do you suppose might be the truth? The truth is, as it's always been, you are worthy. But not only this, you have been worthy all along. You were worthy before your parents got divorced. You were worthy before the bully started picking on you. You were worthy before you had to move from school to school. You were worthy before you lost that friendship. You were worthy before your pet died. The truth is that you were always likable before your parents' divorce. You were always likable before your pet died. You were always likable before you moved from school to school. You have always been whole and complete, and you have always been good enough. You matter as you have always mattered. You have always been loved and valuable right from the beginning. What beginning might that be? From your conception, from your birth, even up to now. You have always mattered. You ultimately mattered to you before your parents divorced. That's why trauma hit you so hard. You always mattered to you before you lost your family pet. That's why their loss hit you so hard. You have always been worthy to you. That's why moving from school to school on a year-to-year basis hit you so hard. You have always been likable to you. That's why the bullying had hit you so hard. You are always whole and complete for you. You are enough for you as you have always been enough. Once you come to this realization, you have then a choice to let the lies you have told yourself for so long, you need to consider letting them go. Can you just breathe with me? Let it go. Let the truth sink in. So let's just sit with this for just a moment. From the day you were conceived to the day you were born to even up to this moment, you were worthy, you are worthy, you forever will be worthy. You were valid then, you're valid now. You will always be valid. You were enough then, you are enough now, as you always will be enough. You were loved, you were whole, you were complete, you were perfect then, and you are all of these things now, as you will always be those things forevermore. However, when the trauma happened, that's when you decided to make the shift, and you only assumed that you became imperfect, unworthy, not lovable, and not enough. So let me say this again. You are worthy. You are already enough, as you were enough, as you are enough. And you will always have been enough. What happened to you had nothing to do with you. It is the people and the environment you were born into that failed you. These people and the environment were not enough for you. They are in error, not you. So let that sink in. You are good enough. Say it with me. I am enough. Yell it. I am enough. Allow yourself to take in this message. You already are in that position of being good enough to be, do, and have everything you have always wanted because you already love yourself. The love is already there. You just have to reach down and find it. You have to discover what it's like to love yourself. The lies deprived you of so much. And I'm going to ask you, what did hiding behind the lies deprive you of emotionally? Well, let's find that out, as I'd like to cap off this podcast with a practical application experiment for you to do in your own home. Go to a mirror and have an erasable marker with you. Look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself this question. How do you ignore yourself? Make note of it on the mirror. Usually it is the first or second thing that comes to your mind. And when you ignore yourself, you have then unknowingly betrayed yourself. In what ways did you betray you? Write that down. Here's a hint. In what ways did you say yes when you wanted to say no, and you said no when you wanted to say yes? Now, in big letters on the mirror, write why. W-H-Y. Your answer is going to bring up some other people as they are responsible for your trauma. This exercise is not to lay blame. It is an exercise in learning how to be faithful to yourself by learning to let go of the pain through the lens of mature understanding. As much as your pain is valid, you have a right to feel the ways that you do, and you have a right to find closure. And I hope that this exercise helps you with that. This exercise helps you to believe in the inevitable, and at times it can be a hard pill to swallow. So let's revisit that question that I had you write down earlier. What is the inevitable? The inevitable, I gave it to you earlier on. Were you listening? It is the truth. And the truth is that we are enough as we always have been enough. It's just inevitable. You can't change it. You can't do anything to change that fact. A fact is a fact. A truth is a truth. Our worthiness is not determined by how we were treated. It never was. Do you think that Jesus being beaten to a bloody pulp by his enemies, do you think that made him unworthy? Do you think that the betrayal of Judas invalidated the life of Jesus? No. Jesus remained as he always has been, God. And just because Jesus hurt and cried and was brutalized and abused does not mean that he became any less of who he ultimately is. So sit with that and think on that, because you are God's son and you are God's daughter. We are all worthy, my friends. No one is counted above another. There is no favorites. A man and a woman are equal, just as friends are equal, just as lovers are equal, just as children are equal, and children are equal to their parents. And the young and old are equal to each other. The people who hurt us failed themselves, and in failing themselves, they failed us. Oh, we can mourn and grieve that loss, as that helps us to work through the shock, as this helps us to let it go. And today in this podcast, we stop shouldering their responsibility. We are not responsible for how we were treated. We were enough then, as we are enough now. That's all we need to know moving forward. So let's get back to this mirror exercise. With the question why on your mirror, and you figuring out who else is involved in shaping your unworthiness, find a picture of the people that caused you all these false assumptions about yourself and tape that to the mirror and tell the picture how the person in that picture made you feel. Draw an arrow from that picture to the word or feeling association. Now, this type of exercise is important, especially when dealing with toxic and narcissistic people. If you feel comfortable after doing this exercise on your own, it is your choice to confront the people you need to face. However, be gentle, kind, and loving. No one likes to feel attacked, and no one wants to feel judged. And I'm here to impress upon you that you might want to consider that if you decide to go and confront someone, don't expect the answers that you are looking for. You might get rejected again, and it's okay. If you're not yet in that heart space to face this challenge on face to face with your loved ones or the person that traumatized you, this mirror effect is top notch and it works very well. Your healing should be just as important to you as the air you breathe. Do not miss out on opportunities that allow you to put yourself first and walk in self-love. You may want to have that heart-to-heart with your loved one, or you may not. It's your choice. There's no pressure. But please keep in mind you might not get the answers, like I said, that you are looking for. Make space for tender-heartedness and a willingness to be open without judgment. The people that hurt you may not know that they did, or they may not be able to face that fact just yet themselves. So lead in with open lines of communication and respect your boundaries as well as theirs. That's why this mirror effect works so well, because it gives you the opportunity to be authentic and stand in the gap for yourself. So when you're done with looking at the truth, look at yourself in the eye and tell yourself you are worthy. You are enough. You always have been enough. And smile. And make the conscious decision to tell yourself these things every time you enter into the bathroom. In this podcast, you have learned how to become authentic with yourself by being honest with yourself. You have to self-evaluate. This is what it means to be self-aware. You can't change what you don't know. And the information in this podcast helps you to get in the know. Those of us who suffer from trauma, either historical or recent, are living in shock. And that shock is what the enemy uses to keep us living in fear as we learn to fear ourselves, as shock exposes our weakened inner beings. The reality is, shock is only meant to be short-lived, and the truth is, shock leads us to assume that we are incapable of living lives in freedom from spiritual disease, the decaying ways of negativity that leads to our spiritual demise. We can heal from emotional shock, as there is a cure from living in the clutches of emotional dysfunction because of trauma. Understanding that you are already enough, you have always been enough because you were already that state before trauma set its eyes upon you. You were enough before the shock took hold in you. And that means you are worthy, as you always have been worthy. You are good enough, just the way you are, as you are more than capable of achieving greatness because there is enough love in you to give back to you. Just remember to ask yourself this important question: why? Be inquisitive about life. Seek answers and never stop seeking until you are satisfied. Asking yourself honest questions never hurt you as much as telling yourself a lie. This is what you discovered in this podcast. So are there any more questions? Thank you for listening. Now go make this day great.